much for the friendly introduction and the invitation. I'm happy to be here. And yeah, please excuse, you have to bear with me for one in a sitting position, and secondly, without a PowerPoint presentation. So it's only going to be the spoken word. I'm sorry for that also because it's already in the afternoon. The room is heating up, but I hope we make it through it. Yeah, I'm happy to be here and share with you in the following some thoughts about the relationship between virtuality and sensing in prosthetic technologies. The field of prosthetics, one can say, has always been associated with the dimensions of sensing and touching. On the one hand, prostheses enable a new kind of feeling, namely and sensation in regions that do not or no longer belong to the body. On the other hand, prosthetic technologies are based on organic material interfaces where body and technology come into contact. Prostheses, therefore, address the area of sensing in at least two ways. On the one hand, they can be described on a perceptive level as media of sensing, insofar as they generate physical sensations. On the other hand, their materiality is based on technical sensors that measure physical signals in order to convert them into technical commands. And in the following, in some parts, I will go a little bit into technical details. I hope that's okay, but maybe we'll make a little turn. Sensing and tactility have therefore always been part of the field of prosthetics. However, this does not necessarily apply to virtuality. If we understand virtuality initially as object-based virtual technologies, it is only recently that a connection between prosthesis and VR has become apparent. However, if virtuality is understood more broadly, namely as a dimension of the imaginary, illusionary, and maybe even the unreal, then virtuality can also be used to build a bridge to the area of body perception, which, among other things, plays also an important role in the context of prosthesis use as well as in rehabilitation. Before we take a closer look at this, we will, in the following right now, consider a little bit the relationship between prosthesis and sensing. The fact that prosthetics are linked to the area of sensitivity does not only apply to today's prosthetic systems. Karin Harasser, who is fortunately also present here today and an expert in prosthetics, for example, showed that the prosthetic developments of the interwar period, in other words, the prosthetic systems developed during World War I, already worked with concepts of sensitivity. Thus, research was already being carried out at that time into the design of so-called actively or rather voluntarily movable prostheses. What made these systems special was their broader objective, which was not only to restore the functionality, but also the sensitivity of the amputated body parts. An example of this is the so-called and pretty famous Sauerbruch arm, a prosthetic system designed by the renowned surgeon Ferdinand Sauerbruch, who worked at the Charité at Berlin. Unlike the mechanical working arms of that time, the Sauerbruch arm focused on the body's own sources of power for prosthetic control, with the amputation stump playing an important role in its design. Thus, the amputation stump was redesigned so that it could serve as a power source to control the prosthetic system itself. This involved, and now some details, using traction and lever mechanisms that mimic the muscular counterforce principle of the human body, thereby reactivating sensations of tension. More precisely, this prosthesis was connected to the amputation stump by an ivory pin that was inserted into the muscle channel and linked to the artificial hand by an iron bracket and a link chain, enabling the force from the muscle contraction to be transmitted to the prosthetic hand. This construction thus created the tension and pressure sensations necessary for the movement of the artificial limb, which then made it possible not only to move the fingers of the prosthetic device individually, but also to convey a feeling for their relative position and the way they were being held. By using the body's own muscle power to control the prosthetic system, the Sauerbruch arm already represented, in a way, a body-powered prosthetic machine. And it was therefore no longer, at least if you want to believe this, merely an instrumental and passive attachment to the human body, but rather was intended to transgress in some way the boundaries of the body and to become a perceived part of the own body. This is where the developments of current prosthetic systems come into play. Here too, research is being conducted into the restoration of physical sensation and new forms of prosthetic feeling. But now, of course, under different technical conditions and with a focus on new body technology interfaces. While in a Sauerbruch arm, the point of contact between the prosthetic system and the body was the remaining muscle strength of the amputation stump, today's prostheses mainly work with neural interfaces, which are designed to establish a direct connection between the body and the prosthetic device. This means that muscle strength is no longer the decisive factor for controlling a prosthesis. Instead, prosthetic control is based on neural impulses that can be read, translated, and generated via signal processing systems. And this entails a number of changes in the development of prosthetics. On the one hand, it can be said that prostheses are now becoming, in a way, more invasive. This means that they are no longer limited to externally visible arm, hand, and leg systems, but now also include implants, which are integrated into the human body and actively intervene in bodily functions. On the other hand, the use of neural interfaces makes the connection between body and prosthesis increasingly seamless. Thus, bulky mechanical pulling and lever mechanisms, which were still a part of older prosthetic systems, are no longer used. Instead, the body and the prosthesis are now more or less directly connected at the level of physical neurons and technical electrodes, at least from a perspective from engineering. These developments then also prompt engineers to come up with new descriptions of today's prosthetic systems. Thus, prostheses are nowadays advertised as thought-controlled or intelligent and sensitive devices. While in one case, the so-called intelligent prosthesis, the idea of a movement should be sufficient to set a prosthetic arm in motion, sensitive prostheses are designed to give the user a sensation for the position and movement of the prosthetic device. In both cases, this requires relatively complicated processes of signal acquisition and signal processing, in other words, translations between the body and the prosthesis, however, with different directions. While thought control systems are based on the conversion of physical signals into technical commands, in other words, body data needs to be translated into technical signals, sensitive devices require technical signals to be translated into neural impulses in order to generate a sensory feedback. More specifically, this means that the data collected by the sensors of the prosthetic system is converted into electrical impulses, which are then transmitted to the sensory cortex via several intermediate steps, where they trigger neural impulses and thus the impression of sensation. Just to give you two examples. One example, for instance, is here the so-called Suralis prosthesis add-on. That is a sensor shoe that is placed over the prosthetic foot. And this system measures the rolling movements of the prosthetic foot by means of sensors The measured signals are then transmitted to an actuator from where they subsequently reach the skin of the amputation stump in the form of vibration patterns. And the aim is for patients to feel the movement of the prosthetic foot, that is to receive feedback on the movement of the prosthesis and thus gain more confidence in walking. On the other hand, research is also being conducted into more invasive forms of prosthetic devices, namely into microelectrodes that are implanted in the nerves of the amputation stump. These electrodes transmit sensor data from the prosthetic hand to the brain in the form of electrical impulses and thus provide sensory feedback. In this way, patients should be able to feel what they are touching, even without visual control, thereby improving their prosthetic movements and, above all, perceiving the movements of the prosthesis as their own. In this context, microsystem engineer Thomas Stieglitz reports on such a procedure. With regard to arm prosthesis, he states, and I quote, "We have developed implantable electrodes that are thinner than a human hair. They were stable in the nerves and did not move. As a result, current pulses could be transmitted to the nerves in a coded form for months, so that patients gradually accepted the prosthesis as their own arm and no longer saw it as a technical foreign body." End of quote. A fact or an observation that leads Stieglitz to the well-known question of where the body ends and technology begins, or to quote, where the boundary between man and machine lies. We can therefore conclude the following. What previously had to be learned in lengthy training phases, that is the control and monitoring of a prosthetic system, is now, at least that's the impression, programmed and automated. At the same time, the developments mentioned here are associated with certain narratives and visions, such as an intuitive prosthesis control and smooth and increasingly trouble-free body technology integrations. On the other hand, however, these developments are also being promoted as a therapy for a phenomenon that always has hindered prosthesis use, namely the phenomenon of phantom sensations or phantom pain. That means the sometimes painful sensation of the body part that is no longer there, or the perception of one's own body in a place that it no longer inhabits. While phantom sensations do not have to hinder the use of prosthesis per se, in some cases they can even be helpful, phantom pain very often means that amputees do not wear their prosthesis and that their incorporation is not successful. Sensory prostheses are here intended to provide a remedy in that they technically generate and compensate for the sensory input lost through the amputation. This is because when a body part is amputated, the transmission, and now it's becoming technical again, the transmission of sensory stimuli is also lost. This loss of sensory feedback is a problem insofar as the body part that is no longer present after an amputation continues to be represented cortically despite its physical absence. In other words, and this is of course the realm, dimension, explanation mode of neuroscience, the central nervous system continues to send signals, neural signals, to the amputated body part even after an amputation, but these signals now remain unanswered. The sensory feedback is missing. This one-sided signal transmission, a kind of signal imbalance, if you like, leads to a stage of neural overcompensation, which can manifest itself in pain. Thus, an amputation, one can say, puts the body into a somatosensory imbalance or incongruence. In a way, body sensation and body shape no longer align, they do not match. Sensory prosthesis are supposed to help here insofar as they generate an artificial sense of touch, a prosthetic feeling, so to speak, through which the body is brought back into a sensory balance. And this is also where the concept of the virtual comes into play. Firstly, as already mentioned, in an objective understanding as the introduction of virtual technologies into prosthetic care, and secondly, insofar as phantom sensations ultimately involve more than just cortical disorders. If we first consider the form and function in which elements of virtual reality are finding their way into prosthetic research, it becomes clear that VR applications initially pursue a similar goal to sensory prosthesis. They aim to restore the body's sensory balance. In contrast to sensory prosthesis, however, the focus here is once again more on the visual aspect, especially the illusionary potential of the visual. And so virtual prosthesis applications, which, by the way, are mainly used in rehabilitation and the treatment of phantom pain, are also linked to a therapeutic approach that, at least implicitly, carries the illusion in its name, which is mirror therapy. This approach, which was developed in the 1990s by Vilayano Ramachandran, is primarily used to treat patients with neurological disorder and is also used in the treatment of phantom pain. In mirror therapy, just as a little reminder, a mirror is placed on the center of the patient's body, and the patients are asked to move the healthy or intact body part. This movement is then mirrored to the patient as a movement of his or her missing body part. At the same time, the intact body part is treated as if it were the missing one. This procedure, which is also described as a trick of the mind, is intended to create the perceptual or also illusionary impression that the missing body part is still present, which can then lead, that's the assumption, to a reduction in phantom pain if successful. So while in mirror therapy, the patient's existing body part is mirrored as their missing body part, in VR settings, the missing body part is simulated within a virtual environment and coupled with tactile feedback. Patients now see their, let's say, missing arm virtually represented, move through a virtual environment with, for instance, both hands, and are asked to move their limbs. At the same time, they wear a prosthesis that measures the muscle activity generated during these movements and which is synchronized with the VR environment. If the patient thus performs a movement in VR, the prosthesis measures the resulting muscle tension and uses this information to generate sensory stimuli, which are at the same time accompanied by the visual impressions of the VR environment. If successful, the patient therefore sees their arm, which is no longer there, and feels it at the same time. The VR application thus creates an overlap of visual and tactile sensations. And it is precisely this combinations of the dimension of sensing and touching in a way that enables VR applications to make something perceptibly accessible that no longer exists, at least not in a physical realm. And on the one hand, these applications are intended to stimulate and promote the process of incorporating a prosthetic system, in other words, the embodiment of a prosthesis. On the other hand, these settings, which are currently still experimental, serve also to alleviate phantom pain. However, phantom sensations are not only seen as a problem here. Rather, they're also being used as a means for the embodiment of a prosthesis. In this context, experiments are being conducted, for instance, to adapt the tactile stimuli of the prosthetic system to the sensations of the phantom limb. In this way, the prosthesis, which does not always match the phantom sensation in its form and location, is intended to grow into the phantom limb. In other words, body and prosthesis are supposed to converge spatially and in terms of their position. This is because sometimes the phantom limb has little to do with the original body, differs in its shape and position from the previous body part, and thus has, as often described, a certain life of its own. For example, the phantom limb can be strangely bent or end shortly after the amputation stump. VR simulations, and that's how they're promoted, are intended to intervene here in the area of body experience by leading to a correction of physical sensation. At the same time, however, this also shows that body perception is a very unstable thing. Because phantom sensations, I think we have to admit, are not only cortical irregularities, but also testify to a quasi-precarious and unstable corporality. In other words, they bear witness to the fact that body boundaries are effects of complex and not always clearly comprehensible processes in which not only neural signal transmissions play a role, but also the dimensions of the imaginary, symbolic, linguistic, and social. However, this takes us into the field of body theory as it is dealt with primarily in feminist studies, phenomenology, and queer theory, among others. To open up the field here would lead probably a little bit too far. But it can be pointed out that the question of phantom pain and body perception in some way also addresses also addresses the status of the body between being one's own and being estranged, as well as being stable and unstable, often at the same time. In this sense, Vivian's subject, herself an amputee and a person who lives with a prosthesis, notes how complicated and confusing the relationship of her virtual phantom limb to her real body is, or rather the relationship of her no longer existing left leg to her still existing and functional right leg. After some reflections on the relationship between lived body experience, embodiment, and bodily integrity, she asks, in a phenomenologically and autobiographically inspired reflection on her amputation experiences, the question, "Where was my leg?" And she answers, I quote, it's a little bit longer. "It had objectively disappeared in the hospital where I left it, without anyone telling me when I asked quite unsentimentally, to no response from disconcerted nurses and doctors, whether it had been put in the trash as a medical waste or put to the service of medical research. But it had also subjectively disappeared. Its presence and absence now marked here and there, and figuring itself in odd ways against the ground of where it once had lived its ordinary form of disappearance, its transparent and enabling absence in presence. On the one hand, propped up on my sofa after surgery, looking at my body stretched out before me as an object, I could see nothing there where my transparently absent left leg had been. On the other hand, feeling my body subjectively along with significant postoperative pain, I most certainly experienced something here, the something sort of like my leg, but not exactly coincident with my memory of its subjective weight and length. And the here, somewhere in the vicinity my leg had previously occupied, but not exactly coincident with what had been its objective form and boundaries. And she continues, looking at the place from which the thing that was my objective leg was absent, no thing was there. And yet the disappearance of my leg, however vague its boundaries, was subjectively experienced as a self of self-presence now and here. Together, however, this objective absence and subjective disappearance did not make, to paraphrase later, a simple negativity. Rather, in their conjunction, doubling, and reversals, they constituted a strange positivity, the presence of an absence. This, however, complicates, end of quote. This, however, complicates the question of the relationship between body prosthesis and phantom limb, especially when considering their affiliation to the realm of the virtual and the real. Instead of being able to clearly assign the one to the other, it seems rather that the body as such is inscribed with a certain instability, incompleteness, and strangeness, an intimate distance, perhaps, to use Francisco Varela's term, or with subject, a constant oscillation between absence and presence. A condition that reveals itself in line with phenomenological thought in moments of disturbances, illness, and anomaly, but which is basically always the case, and which one could add is perhaps rooted in the inner difference and relational dependency of corporality, but that opens up another field of body theory, and I leave it here. Thank you very much for your attention.